Hi, everybody. Hi. I'm Nina Katchadorian, and on behalf of the Distinguished Faculty Lecture Committee, Dean Suzanne Wofford, and the Gallatin School, I am very pleased to welcome Professor Kay Kaufman Shelemay. Professor Shelemay is professor of music at Harvard University, where she has been on the faculty since 1992. She's also a former chair of the Department of Music at Harvard. And previous to teaching at Harvard, she taught at Wesleyan, Columbia, and NYU. Professor Shelemay's bio on the Harvard website describes her as an ethnomusicologist specializing in musics of Africa, the Middle East, and the urban United States. But this strikes me as almost comically truncated, because when you open her book Soundscapes, it's like discovering a radio with the entire world's music playing across all the stations. The listening guide for the book starts with tube and throat singing and ends with Vietnamese karaoke, with stations along the way that include South Indian lullabies, Ethiopian Christian Christmas music, Mexican-American corridos, Shoshone flag songs, Inuit vocal games, Cajun and Zydeco songs, Irish jigs, and songs from the immigrant Syrian Jewish communities in New York City. And I have a hunch that we are going to have an excellent playlist accompany this lecture tonight. A great deal of Professor Shelemay's work does think about diaspora and immigration, and the way music reflects human movement and displacement, whether by choice or not. She speaks about a soundscape as something that's like a seascape, because of its ability to, as she says, both stay in place and to move in the world, to absorb changes in its content and performance styles, and to continue to accrue new layers of meanings. And given our fondness here at Gallatin for the fruits of cross-pollination, things that work this way certainly lie very close to the hearts and intellectual interests of many of us here. Professor Shelemay's talk tonight is entitled Musical and Moral Leaders, the Musician in Society. And the description of the talk goes on to say, we too often underrate the role of musicians who through musical leadership exercise moral authority in society. Shelemay suggests that musicians often move beyond the act of performance to redress grievances, evoke long-forgotten memories, and help us imagine the world anew. I'm sure many of us here engaged in creative work have asked ourselves what our work can do right now, and I am grateful to you for allowing us to give serious thought tonight to the deeply useful role that music and the arts can have. I also wanted to insert a very short personal story about ethnomusicology for the undergraduate students who might be in the room. I'm a visual artist, and I was a visual arts and literature major in college. But a friend of mine who was an anthropology major had spent a semester abroad in Bali studying Balinese gamelan music. And he came back determined to establish a gamelan ensemble at school. And I got roped in because he basically needed more bodies behind the instruments. And a year later, I found myself in Bali on the same program that my friend had been on, studying gamelan myself, and having gotten completely hooked on this intricate, amazing, fascinating musical form. And I think what's important to say is that my fascination was not just because of how it sounded, but really because what it felt like to play this music socially. And so, you know, in the briefest terms here, the way Balinese music works is that you are playing part of a pattern that interlocks with another pattern. And what eventually happens when you learn your part well is you can forget your part, and paradoxically, by doing that, you can kind of hear the bigger part, the more complex interwoven music that comes out of the combination of all these instruments. Music in Bali also has a deeply ingrained place in the ritual, in village life, in various forms of entertainment there. And I had never had an experience like this before with an art form. So for me, this kind of detour outside of my usual studies was truly formative and has given me new metaphors that have kind of followed me around my whole life and impacted everything I've ever learned or studied or taught since then. So no matter what your concentration, think about taking an ethnomusicology class, because I really think it's one of the most thrilling interdisciplinary experiences you can have. Professor Shelemay's awards and honors are numerous and include grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and more importantly, she told me, the Ethiopian Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Radcliffe Institute. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as well. She is currently preparing the 3rd edition of Soundscapes and is writing a book on musicians from the Horn of Africa in transnational motion based on ethnography carried out across North America. I'm so happy to welcome Professor Kay Kaufman Shelemay. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say, that was just a wonderful introduction, and I wondered if maybe I wanted to hear you speak now. Thank you for all the kind words, not just about me, but about my field. I do believe in ethnomusicology as an extraordinary adventure, and hopefully something that's deeply worthwhile. So thank you for that. And I have to say, I am so happy to be here at NYU. And I can remember very much teaching folks from Gallatin when I was on the faculty, and it was always a pleasure because they were creative and they were just as individualistic and interdisciplinary as they were billed. And it was really wonderful, and it's always wonderful to come back. So thank you for having me. And I wanted to talk today about the role of music and musicians within society, which has been the subject of earlier writings. I'm surely not the first. And what comes to mind is the celebration of music as an annunciatory vocation by Jacques Attali, the French social theorist. And Attali argued that we should view the musician as a creator who changes the world's reality. That's a quote. Attali goes on to suggest that music is prophecy, with the musician acting simultaneously as reproducer and prophet. While I will not argue today for viewing musicians as prophets, I will suggest that music often moves well beyond the act of performance to exercise both initiative and agency within society. We tend to underrate the role of musicians, who through musical prowess as well as other skills can exercise leadership and can wield moral authority. The full dimensions of the impact of musicians and their music is not often enough acknowledged, although their songs speak to us in important ways, and I think you quoted this, redressing grievances, evoking long-forgotten memories, and helping us reimagine the world anew. So I'm going to seek to acknowledge musicians today and suggest a new way of thinking about these musical and moral leaders. Perhaps no better current example can be given of the power of song, and its singer is Bob Dylan. Let me see if I can work this right. Here we go. Who was, of course, awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in fall 2016, and a quote from the write-up, for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. The Nobel Prize Committee noted that Dylan had, quote, recorded a large number of albums revolving around topics like the social conditions of man, religion, politics, and love. But Dylan himself commented most tellingly on the role of the musician in his lyrics to one of his early songs, Long Time Gone. And I'd like just to play a section of this.
You might see me on your crossroads when I'm passing through. Remember me how you wish to as I'm drifting from your view. I ain't got the time to think about it, I got too much to get done. But I'm a long time coming, and I'll be a long time gone. If I can help somebody with a word or a song, if I can show somebody they are traveling wrong. But I know I ain't no prophet, and I ain't no prophet's son. I'm just a long time coming, and I'll be a long time gone.
Well, Dylan clearly speaks about helping and guiding others, although he also does not consider himself to be a prophet, but that Bob Dylan's songs do speak in important ways through their texts and tunes and sound worlds they create is also clear from the tributes paid when Dylan won a Pulitzer Prize a decade ago in 2007. The formal citations cited, and I quote, his profound impact on popular music and American culture, marked by lyrical compositions of extraordinary poetic power, end quote. With a bit of reflection, we can probably all cite a number of prominent musicians who have, past and present, and especially under political pressures and during times of extreme social stress, have used their music to transform the world around them. Let me mention just three, and they are pictured here. And I would include Kulthum, maybe I won't use the laser, on the upper with her pictures superimposed on the pyramids, Fela Kuti from Nigeria on the right. And Fela Kuti, the Nigerian musician, was a political activist. He innovated Afrobeat music and was a voice of resistance against authoritarian regimes and social inequality in his native Nigeria and elsewhere in Africa during the 1970s and 80s. Fela Kuti was frequently arrested and subject to beatings by Nigerian government officials, which he accused of corruption. He was a controversial figure, one who both fought for rights and was at moments unconventional and even transgressive in his own life. Yet, Fela Kuti was keenly aware of his power as a musician, and in an interview commented, and I quote, "Music wants to dictate a better life against a bad life." If some musicians, such as Fela Kuti, have had strong moral impact through their political actions, as well as through their music, others have achieved a dominant position in society through the overwhelming power of their music and voice alone. Among the examples we might cite are Kulthum on the pyramids, lauded by her biographer Virginia Danielson as the voice of Egypt, and known across the Middle East from her broadcasts beginning in the 1930s on early Egyptian radio, as well as her many sound recordings. Kulthum became an ubiquitous symbol of her country and much of the Middle East, in large part because of her ability to inculcate the quality of tarab, literally enchantment, which moved her listeners and reinforced their attachment to the Arab nation. Her 1975 funeral brought millions of Egyptians to line the streets of Cairo to watch memorial processions, and her voice is still widely heard across many media in the Middle East. And much of her moral authority, if I can use that expression, came from her heritage as an Islamic chanter's daughter, and much of the power of her voice and her articulation of text emerged from that background as well. Other musicians, especially in recent decades, have established their moral authority as leaders through social and economic efforts in support of human rights and other meritorious international causes. One who comes to mind is Bono, the third on my slide, the Irish musician who made his reputation with the band U2 and who has moved into a position of social leadership through massive charitable giving and personal initiatives, ranging from his leadership with UNICEF to the Special Olympics to Oxfam. Bono has led collaborative recording projects in support of famine relief, such as Live Aid. Unlike Fela Kuti, whose initiatives were largely focused on Nigeria and Africa, and Kulthum, whose impact was largely bounded by the borders of the Middle East and its diaspora, Bono has been a global leader on behalf of the dispossessed, especially those displaced by natural disasters. Fela Kuti, Kulthum, Bono, all are musicians who have come to regional and international fame and attention. They all had ambition, skills, and resources to do good works on an unparalleled scale. But what about musicians who were not in the international mainstream and who, unlike Bob Dylan, do not win prestigious prizes? Are other musicians serving as leaders and moral guides? I suggest that the answer is yes, and will provide some examples from my own research with Ethiopian musicians. Since the beginning of the Ethiopian Revolution in 1974, and this is the neighborhood in which that event happened in Africa, adjacent to the Red Sea, many musicians have been forced to migrate to many locales worldwide, with the largest Ethiopian and Eritrean communities outside their homeland now in the United States. There are many examples of musicians' moral and musical leadership that I can cite from the Ethiopian domain, beginning at home in the Horn of Africa, where musicians long played a central role in society. And let me start with a central musical figure for centuries, the Ethiopian Asmari, the minstrel, who performed in venues ranging from the Ethiopian court to local coffee houses, singing about deeply held traditions, as well as transmitting the latest news and offering often stinging commentary on current events. These minstrels, the Asmaris, took advantage of a system of double meanings intrinsic to Ethiopian languages to level social criticism of all sorts, frequently taking their patrons to task with veiled accusations about abuses of power. This textual tradition, known in the Horn of Africa as wax and gold, refers to the lost wax process of gold casting, in which the wax form melts within the mold as the molten gold is poured in. In the past, many minstrels lost their lives when their criticism went too far and their patrons discovered the true meanings of their songs. These Ethiopian Asmaris were important figures who exercised power, some literally serving as guards at the doors of the gates of the emperor's palace. They were central to the expression of patriotism and became powerful symbols of the nation, and they were systematically hunted down and killed by Italians who occupied Ethiopia between 1936 and 1941. The minstrel tradition rebounded after Ethiopia successfully defeated the Italians, and one today encounters minstrels performing in Ethiopia as well as internationally. And here you see a modern Ethiopian Asmari. You may be able to tell, if you know it well, that this was on the Washington, D.C. Mall. You can see the top of one of the museums behind you, and performing at the Ethiopian Millennium Celebration in 2008. Let me delve a little more deeply into the contributions of the modern minstrel to the well-being of a society in transition in the Ethiopian American diaspora, and I'd like to take a brief look at the career of two individuals. The first is the beloved Talela Kabeda, a legend both in her homeland and its diaspora as a rare female Asmari and actress. The second is Yehuni Belai, a minstrel of the younger generation who has been an active agent in reshaping social and community life in the Ethiopian diaspora. And let's begin with Talela Kabeda. Talela was a leading actress and singer from the 1950s at the Ethiopian National Theater, where she was widely revered. She had become a minstrel as a teenager, a career she pursued despite the strong disapproval of her parents. But the inception of the Ethiopian Revolution marked a traumatic turning point in her life and career that has led her to exercise leadership nationally and internationally. During the early months of the Ethiopian Revolution in 1974, before the Emperor Haile Selassie's overthrow, there was a period known as the creeping coup, during which a military government slowly assumed power. It was a time of great tension, and when fears for the future of the country surfaced in many quarters, including in song, and severe treatment of musicians ensued. During the time of the creeping coup, Talela Kabeda recorded the song Lomi Tera Tera. This is the song by the well-known composer, lyricist Getachew Debalke, and obviously Talela was a singer. And I will play it for you in a minute. I should tell you a little more about the song and its text. The text mourned the death of a mother who had given birth to 14 children. This, in wax and gold, was a veiled allusion to Mother Ethiopia and the country's then 14 provinces. However, the song's refrain, Lomi Tera Tera, which on the surface refers to a section of a traditional market where only one type of product, in this case lemons, sold, masked a hidden meaning, wax masking gold. When sung, the phrase can be heard to be the Amharic language idiom, Lomi Bayatera, meaning each according to his fate, and it implies an uncertain future for national identity. Let me play this for you. Talela has quite an unusual vocal style, and this was a re-recording made in her 70s. Talela Kabeda says that the song was intended to criticize the emperor's repressive policies and to express concern about the secession of Eritrea from Ethiopia as a result of an ongoing civil war and hence loss of one of the 14 provinces or children. Both lyricist Getachew Debalke and singer Talela Kabeda were taken into custody by the military forces, who were in the process of overthrowing the monarchy. While Talela was released from the feared Sendafa prison north of Addis Ababa after 3 months' confinement, lyricist Getachew Debalke remained in detention for 8 years. For 2 years after her release from prison in 1974, Talela survived economically by performing privately in her own home. And by the way, Ethiopians are generally referred to by their first name, so it's not disrespectful to call people by their first name in speaking about them. This resulted in a second brief imprisonment of Talela on the grounds that, quote, bourgeois people came there to her house. Talela evidently eventually returned to a position at the National Theater, where she remained until the end of the revolution in 1991. However, the subsequent government continued to harass Talela, who in 2003 sought asylum in the United States and today lives permanently in Silver Spring, Maryland. And here's a picture of Talela with her daughter and granddaughter during an interview we held at the Library of Congress. In diaspora, as well as at home in Ethiopia, Talela's activism and leadership have been directed in part through her musical and theatrical performances. She told me in an interview, and I quote her, "To me, the theater and music are places you can express yourself. Sometimes you do something with a feeling that performance is good, even for a person who doesn't want to hear it." End quote. Talela has also been active with the Ethiopian Human Rights Committee and has been honored for her work. And today, she actively mentors young Ethiopian musicians in diaspora and voices a very strong concern for their future. And I'd like to quote her again. "I am the mother, and they are my daughters and sons. I have to protect them, even if they don't want advice from me." End quote. She's concerned that most Ethiopian musicians in diaspora are forced to work outside music to make a living, and that as a result, they don't have time to focus on their musicality. Talela Kabeda minimizes her song's roles in political discourse and the manner in which her performances have put her at risk, and I quote her again, "I do not know about politics, but I love my country. I have a friend who, whenever he starts talking, it might be on one subject, but it'll end up as politics. Sometimes I talk what I feel. But whenever I do politics and I can express myself, whenever I do politics and music, I can express myself, whether in music or theater. People may interpret it in whichever way they wish. The interpretation sometimes becomes whatever they want it to say. So my performance is a sort of acting. Even if a person doesn't want to hear it, he can understand." End quote. If Talela Kabeda has served as a protector, and I would argue moral guide, to many younger musicians, and has inspired others to speak out against tyranny through her music and other activities supporting human rights, her work has been carried out on a largely private level. She has neither Bono's public platform nor his resources. But many other Asmaris have been active both in their musical professions and in founding institutions within diaspora communities. And let me turn to one, Yehuni Belai, for a second brief example. This is an album cover, an early album color of Yehuni's. Yehuni Belai began performing as a child, and he gave me a great picture of an early performance. He became a professional musician at age 18 in 1979 when he joined a revolutionary-era performing arts ensemble named after a town in the region from which he came in Ethiopia's Rift Valley. While on a concert tour to the U.S. in 1993, Yehuni met and married his wife, who goes by the nickname Tutu. And Tutu had arrived in the United States a few years previously as a student and had just begun the Ethiopian Yellow Pages in Washington, D.C. And here you have one of the volumes. Since resettling in the U.S., Yehuni continued his career as a leading performer of Ethiopian traditional music and song, traveling widely to perform at diaspora events and weddings in the U.S., Israel, and Australia. The need for musicians to perform for weddings has been a new aspect of musical life in diaspora and has given rise to a network of mobile musicians. Yehuni also became vice president of the Ethiopian Yellow Pages, in which he played a central role as it became a major source for commerce and networking in the Ethiopian community, both in the United States and internationally. About a decade ago, Yehuni founded Little Ethiopia restaurant in Northwest Washington. And in the diaspora, Ethiopian restaurants are both meeting places for the community and for others, and important sites for musical performance year-round. And here you can see minstrels performing for guests in the restaurant. While Little Ethiopia recently closed just a few months ago, to my regret, it is one of a vast network of Ethiopian restaurants that serve as venues for Ethiopian musicians worldwide. Yehuni, also known universally by his first name, continues to publish recordings. He is particularly active in maintaining a network of Asmaris and other traditional Ethiopian musicians. Although he lives in Virginia and is very cosmopolitan, he publishes recordings of Ethiopian traditional music, many recorded in Ethiopia, and he visits his homeland frequently. Yehuni is well aware that the traditions he performs are rapidly changing at home as well, but he prefers to keep traditions from the past as part of his focus. In fact, I have to show you, he had a picture taken of himself as a goat shepherd in front of a backdrop of the Blue Nile to use as the cover of one of his CDs. And Yehuni was a shepherd as a boy in the Rift Valley, so this is not so far from the truth. But Yehuni acknowledges that this retrospective image has elicited remarks, and I'd like to quote him. "You don't see all Ethiopians dressing like this. This is how I dressed. I'm shepherding the goats near the Blue Nile with a flute." And I sent the picture to Ethiopia from the U.S., and people were amazed. "What? In America they dress like this?" they asked. They were expecting Michael Jackson. Anyway, other than his albums, Yehuni and his wife Tutu are prominent anchors of the Ethiopian community in Washington, D.C., in business, in social life, and politics, all the while seeking to represent and lead their community in broader political circles. And one of my favorite pictures of Yehuni with then-Senator Hillary Clinton. Ethiopian musicians such as Yehuni Belai and Talela Kabeda play important roles in both linking members of their far-flung diaspora community with treasured traditions of their homelands, while at the same time bringing that community together in new settings. Their important work may not have a high profile outside their communities, but they are major figures among many immigrants for whom musical role models provide critical reinforcement in negotiating a new society every day. Both musicians also provide vital moral leadership. They both advise and support a great number of musicians and others struggling to make a career against all odds. If the two Ethiopian musicians I've discussed so far are both leaders from the world of secular music, there are also musicians in the sacred domain who have served as guards and guides for their traditions, as well as founded the institutions that anchor Ethiopian religious life at home and abroad. Most prominent are those in the Ethiopian Orthodox churches, now present in most American cities. Ethiopia has one of the earliest Ethiopian churches, Christian churches in the world, dating from the year 332 A.D. The Ethiopian emperors, of whom Haile Selassie was the last, also served as heads of the church. Thus, the 1974 revolution by a Marxist military regime forced many Ethiopian Christians into exile, and Ethiopian diaspora communities have struggled to sustain their Orthodox religious traditions abroad. Ethiopian Christianity has its own language, indigenous liturgy, and a rich range of musical traditions, including a wonderful form of indigenous chant. And I'd like to give you some idea of the rich regalia and ritual process of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And you have an image here of the Christmas ritual at the famous Ethiopian rock churches of Lalibela. And the musicians are singing a famous chant for Christmas Day, and I'd like you to hear this chant. A little louder. That gives you a bit of an idea of the power of those rituals. So what you just heard, you could see, is led by a special group of musicians called Debtera, who trained for decades in rural monasteries to master the complex liturgy, its chant, and its unique system of musical notation. And the first of these musicians, skipped one, there we go. First of these musicians was, according to Ethiopian legend, a 6th century monk named Saint Yared, who is supposed to have composed the entire liturgy through inspiration by the Holy Spirit, which came to him in the form of 3 birds, and you can see that on the top left. And here you see both traditional illuminations of Saint Yared in an Ethiopian manuscript, the 2 left-hand panels, and I can tell you the story of the bottom one later. And a modern painting of the saint from an Ethiopian painter today living in Washington, D.C. And St. Yared remains a model for Ethiopian faith and moral behavior across the diaspora. Modern church musicians follow the model of St. Yared, and I'd like to speak briefly about the career and leadership of one prominent church musician, the distinguished Mogus Sium. And here you have a double portrait in regalia, on the left, wearing the dress of St. Yared. Here, Mogus is seen in a traditional role, and he was born in 1949 in the central Ethiopian countryside to a family of church musicians. He was trained from childhood in rural churches and monasteries as both a musician and as a priest. Mogus became a master of liturgical musical performance, instrumental practice, and liturgical dance. In 1970, he left Ethiopia with the support of the Homeland Church to undertake theological studies in Greece. When the revolution began and the church was thrown into turmoil, Mogus decided not to return home. He eventually received political asylum in the U.S. in 1982. There he joined a friend in Dallas, where he co-founded the St. Michael Church in nearby Garland, Texas. In 1989, he left the Dallas church to join another priest and to found St. Mary's Church in Washington, D.C. And today, St. Mary's is one of the largest Ethiopian churches in the diaspora worldwide. You can't tell how large it is, but this is the end of a massive warehouse that has served as a church. And you see Mogus standing outside. One can see many manifestations of creative leadership over the course of Mogus's residency in the U.S. In the beginning, he tried to reproduce the liturgy and its music from the Ethiopian Christian past, an attempt to maintain a complex Ethiopian liturgical cycle in diaspora. While the Mass can be chanted by a single priest, the heart of the musical liturgy, as you've heard, requires a large number of trained musicians able to perform with varying instrumental accompaniment and dance. And this is a photograph from inside the St. Mary's Church in Washington, Mogus's church. Mogus is in this picture, but you can't see him from this angle. However, in Washington, D.C., Mogus confronted enormous challenges and realized that he had to teach congregants to perform the liturgy since there were not enough trained musicians to sustain it. In 2000, he began to offer a weekly music class on Saturday morning, and he taught a group of men from his church musical chants from Ethiopian rituals. Each man records the class and listens to the recordings at home to master the chants for the next week. Mogus, who teaches voluntarily despite working 2 full-time jobs outside the church to support himself, feels that his pedagogical efforts are vital. As it became clear that classes alone would not be sufficient to sustain transmission of the liturgy in diaspora, Mogus and several colleagues next acquired land in Houston, Texas, seeking to found a monastery to train musicians. They are raising funds for the monastery's construction. Over the last decade, Mogus has also expanded his efforts to embrace new demands of the diaspora, and I'll quote him. "In the American society, we have a plan," he says. "There is the game of promotion." He frequently arranges Ethiopian liturgical performances for major American festivals and concerts. He is aware that to play a role in American society, Ethiopian chant must be prepared to move out of the church and into the concert hall. Mogus has garnered in national recognition for his musicianship and musical leadership in his community. And here we are the day he was named a National Humanities Fellow at Congress in 2009. Like Mogus, other Ethiopian liturgical musicians have had to assume wide-ranging responsibilities for founding and sustaining Ethiopian churches in their communities across the U.S. In many cases, especially in the frequent absence of a priest, the musician himself must assume responsibility as the religious and moral leader of the church. Beyond the active minstrels and church musician I've mentioned, other performers who are not solely musicians but who are deeply involved in a range of creative musical activity undertake profound responsibilities on behalf of their communities. One of the most famous is the poet, actress, and prolific song lyricist Alamsahai Wadajio. She received asylum in the U.S. after the Ethiopian Revolution ended in 1991 and lives in Silver Spring, Maryland. Born in Addis Ababa in 1955, Alamsahai was a leading actress and director at the Ethiopian National Theater, as well as a playwright and the most famous Ethiopian song lyricist internationally. Her first efforts in diaspora were devoted to founding an all-Ethiopian artist organization that was active for 3 years. And after this failed, she founded a theatrical and musical troupe, and it was called Tayatu. Tayatu was named after the turn of the 20th century Ethiopian queen, who was legendary for having led troops into battle against the Italians and defeating them at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This was before they came back 40 years later and occupied the country, but a woman is at least reputed to have been instrumental in their defeat. Alam Sahai recalls about founding Tayatu, and I quote her, "It was really hard to organize. I myself was a newcomer, and the use of the organization was not well known at that time. So I stopped. So I stopped and I said, I need to have something. So I went to a lawyer and I asked what I had to do, and he wrote the article of incorporation, and that's how I founded Tayatu. Tayatu performs Ethiopian and Western dramatic and musical works. The actors and musicians often travel to perform at the invitation of other Ethiopian diaspora communities. And a few months ago, they came to Boston, and they performed at a school in Cambridge and performed a version of a very famous Ethiopian play about a late 19th century emperor. A poetry reading spearheaded by Alam Sahai also meets monthly at different venues in the Washington, D.C. area. Alam Sahai has organized choirs of Ethiopian children to sing and perform at various community events, such as the opening of the annual Ethiopian soccer tournaments, and she has been the organizing force behind most major Ethiopian diaspora-wide events of the last 20 years, such as the Millennium celebrations in 2008. Best known for her poetry, which appeared in 2 published volumes, Alam Sahai has also written lyrics, as I've mentioned, for more than 40 renowned Ethiopian singers. Her musical and other performance initiatives are both reflective and transformative in terms of their relation to the Ethiopian performing arts and music and the community that sustains them. I would say that Alam Sahai is the muse of the Ethiopian diaspora, a strong moral voice in the spoken word and in song. Alam Sahai's attitude toward her and others' agency on behalf of the arts and community is perhaps most directly expressed through her poems. Some of them are modeled on the traditional war songs which women sang to inspire soldiers to battle. Alam Sahai's poem, "The Soul Has a Message," states with deep conviction the responsibility of the individual to work on behalf of others, as well as to plan for the future. And this is her poem, "The Soul Has a Message." From the time it came until it goes back out of a borrowed body, the soul has a message. It has a share to perform in the means, to create for her likes, to work for others, to plan for the future, to spin comfort. The soul has a message. It is entrusted with an assignment. I could cite many more examples of musicians and others closely involved in the musical arts who have become musical and moral leaders within Ethiopia and its diaspora. During good times, they celebrate their communities and their accomplishments. During bad times, they emerge as leaders, guards, and guides. This activity and the extraordinary initiatives of many musicians that have only come to my attention as a result of many years of ethnographic observation and interviews. They have led me to propose a new framework to discuss the musician in society, and I'd like to talk briefly about that now. For a long while, I had thought of Ethiopian musicians as canaries in the coal mines of revolution and exile. But musicians' voices in revolutionary and post-revolutionary Ethiopia, as well as in the diaspora, were not silenced by a poisonous environment, as were the canaries, those famous sentinel birds, and whose death signaled the presence of dangerous gases in the mine. Rather, musicians offer their communities protection and guidance through continuing to sing, as well as initiating a range of other initiatives that enhance and sustain their communities' lives. And I have started referring to the musicians as sentinel musicians. And a sentinel is someone or something that keeps watch or guards. And that is its most straightforward historical meaning from the 16th century origin in European military contexts, as someone or something that keeps watch or stands guard. The etymology of the word sentinel remains uncertain, but it likely derives, due to its connection to perceiving or watching, from the Italian word sentire, to hear, probably itself derived from the Latin. If the ability to hear and to perceive keenly is vital to the success of a sentinel, few are as potentially sensitive as are musicians. Musical training is increasingly credited with enhancing human cognitive development, and here I cite some recent literature, and including the positive impact of musical activities on neural networks associated with focused attention. And here the work of Anirudh Patel has been very, very useful. Moving from scientific findings to even casual ethnographic observations of music making in Ethiopia, one finds a deep-seated association between those who keep watch, as we've seen, shepherds guarding rural fields and livestock, to guards protecting urban compounds, and performing all the while on flutes or other instruments. The historical role of musicians in perceiving events and sharing information through song and narration remains heightened in locales such as the African Horn, where oral transmission remains a primary channel for communication. The connection between a sentinel role in the play of the senses is actually highlighted in the Amharic language. The word hawas refers to a physical sense or sensibility, while the verb hawasa means to watch or observe, and the noun hawas refers to a watchman or observer. And I rather like the parallels in Amharic. Over time, the word sentinel expanded from its early connection with guarding to take on new meaning in a series of compound phrases. Among the first were poetic references to sentinel stars, evoked as keeping watch and guiding travelers along the way. And here I'd like to just quote a couple of lines from Thomas Campbell, 1855, The Soldier's Dream. And our bugles sang truce, for the night cloud had lowered, and the sentinel stars set their watch in the sky. Over time, sentinel came to have numerous new significations. For instance, in medical domains, where a sentinel node is the primary indicator of the spread of disease. By the 20th century, the term sentinel was adapted to name devices that signaled the depth of the water through which a boat was sailing. There is also the sentinel crab, that watchful crab of the Indian Ocean, and even the fanciful sentinel robots in comics featured on the Marvel Universal Wiki tended to save humanity from mutants. In computing, a sentinel character marks the beginning or end of a block of data. Musicians' roles in society have much in common with many old and new meanings of the word sentinel. They serve as guards, as guides, and nodes in emerging networks, all the while sounding dimensions of change in the communities in which they live. So I propose a neologism, sentinel musician, and will use this expression to designate a musician who has served his or her society with vigilance, drawing on heightened powers of perception and performance. A sentinel musician watches and listens with care, and at pivotal moments may offer warnings or commentaries through his or her music and its performance. Some sentinel musicians have literally led the ways to new locales, establishing far-flung networks, founding new institutions, and undertaking other initiatives in community building. All of these activities require a full measure of personal agency, the ability to be creative under adverse circumstances, and a willingness to extend oneself on behalf of the welfare of others. Musicians can also offer emotional depth and sustenance to the displaced, and can call on the power of their music to transform and to heal. That is, they do become healers and moral leaders. I believe that sentinel musicians are found in many traditions, and that they play important roles in their own societies. It may well be the case that not all sentinel musicians are necessarily positive guards and guides. We have only to recall the sirens from Greek mythology, who lured sailors to their death through their songs, providing us with a name for auditory warning signals. But today I've chosen to focus on the positive powers of music and the agency of real musicians who have and continue to use their music to guard and to guide. What musical sentinels come to your minds? Here in New York City, the conductor-composer Leonard Bernstein was a guide to so many through his musical innovations engagement with civil rights and gender diversity, and as a founder of the Pacific Music Festival in Sapporo, Japan, just before his death in 1990, a project that intended to deepen international understanding through intercultural exchange through music. The renowned cellist Yo-Yo Ma has sparked creative work in education and cross-cultural communication through his long-standing Silk Road project and the Multicultural Silk Road Ensemble. And I'm teaching a course with the musicians of the Silk Road Ensemble this semester. And each one of them, in addition to the community effort of the ensemble, is involved in his or her own efforts at home and abroad. There are so many more musicians from less prominent venues who are little known to a broad public who almost surely deserve a measure of recognition for sentinel activity. If I began this talk with a verse from Bob Dylan's A Long Time Gone, I want to end with a verse from a poem very well known by Maya Angelou, and this is her Caged Bird. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. So I think I'll end there. I would really welcome your comments and questions, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. We have time for some questions. Yes. Ask away. I would also love feedback. This is actually very new work, and I've just written this talk for you. So I would very much love feedback.
Oh, thank you very much. That was great.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So I'm always interested in how diasporic music particularly moves and changes, right? And you talked about the church music moving to the concert hall.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you'd say more about other ways that that's happened and the effect that's had.
Well, one finds immediately there are a lot of changes, and there are changes that affect the sound of the music from changes in instruments. Some of it's interesting also trying to gauge what happens in the homeland and what happens in the diaspora. There are startling innovations in Ethiopian liturgical music. I didn't get into that, but there are now female participants after 1,500 years of men only, and many of these emerged because of a new genre of hymn that were composed and now are sung very widely in the diaspora. And I assumed early on, at a period where I still couldn't go back to Ethiopia because of the revolution and everything that had happened, that these were all diasporic innovations. And I only later found out through ethnography that, in fact, they were an innovation introduced by a very accomplished musician who had started this whole genre of what are called Sunday school songs, hymn, that incorporated young men and young women in Ethiopia, and they had spread like wildfire. He actually is now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, if you can imagine my good fortune of landing next door to this man. So that sort of change, so big changes in performance practice, big changes in construction of instruments, a lot of use of electronic amplification, although that also was very much underway at home, but it's really gone very, very much stronger in diaspora. You also have different settings of music. Ethiopian musicians go to folklife festivals and they perform in environments that they never would have performed in before. Asmari would have performed in a little coffee house, and now he'll go and perform on a stage at a folklife festival in Maine or Richmond or anywhere else you want. And then finally, the significance of things are changing, and you find that people add, there's sort of the folkloristics of testimony about what they're doing and how they're singing it. And you also have a new generation of singers and musicians in the U.S. in particular, many young Ethiopians born here who are rediscovering traditions of their homeland and then are doing very, very different kind of tropes on those. A wonderful young singer named Meklit from the San Francisco Bay Area does a lot of Afrofuturistic takes on Ethiopian music and other types of popular music. So any which way, does that kind of do a bit?
And you sort of started to answer this, but then I wondered how much of that works its way back to
A lot,
Ethiopia.
it does, and some of them travel. They all want to visit the homeland. Most of them do, and some people have moved back. And this is where it gets to be a very circular motion, and there's a lot of contact back and forth. So one really has to do this as a transnational project. You can't look at one end or the other. It doesn't entirely make sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you for your talk.
You're so welcome.
Two things. I recently, probably about a year ago, I heard a really wonderful pianist, Emohoy Segwe.
Yes.
Miriam Gabru.
Emohoy.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I was just wondering if you, what did you know about her and her work? Because it was just absolutely mesmerizing music, and it was beautiful. And the second question. I really loved how you talked about the Sentinel and made me think about The Matrix, the film The Matrix. And
Oh, that's interesting.
Sentinel, I guess, robots that are sort of agents of the state. And it sort of made me think the ways in which you talked about the Ethiopian Revolution. And I was just curious about how did music change at that moment of the revolution, and what are the ways in which those musicians became in what ways did the state sort of utilize music and musicians in order to advance a sort of particular political project?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Emohoy is kind of a unique phenomenon. I mean, she was abroad for periods of time, and she's a pianist. And it's just a very, very unusual thing. I did not have contact with her. I've always been more interested in traditions that emerge, I guess, indigenous traditions, and there weren't many pianists around. I'm not sure during the early period I lived in Ethiopia, she was not much in evidence. She may have been abroad. At one point, I'm trying desperately to bring up aspects of her biography because I've read about them. I haven't thought about it in a while, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure I can give you letter and verse. You can probably get them on the internet. But it's interesting. She combines Ethiopian modal practice and the sort of redundancy that you have in a lot of Ethiopian music with a lot of small phrases that are repeated with kind of new age feelings. And so you get this really interesting synthesis. I don't know if that description seems accurate at all to you.
It does.
And so, but she's an interesting figure, and some people, there's lately been an Emohoy revival. There is a volume of her music in the Ethiopiques series, which is that wonderful series of CDs out of Paris, out of Buddha Records, and it has like 30 volumes, and it's great. It has put a lot of Ethiopian music and musicians on the map, including, I suspect, Emohoy's more recent fame has been due to that. Now, in terms of the revolution, how did it affect musicians? It shut down musical life. There were curfews. It was dangerous to go out. You really weren't allowed to socialize in groups. So most of the clubs and things like that stopped. There were a few things that were left in hotels because there you could stay overnight and so they could perform and you were there anyway. But there were new musical groups that were started. There were revolutionary soldiers singing groups. There were youth groups like the one that Yehuni Belai was in during the revolution in different of the provinces. They started revolutionary groups and they performed. They also started circuses that did acrobatics and music and all sorts of stuff. So there were a lot of things for young people, and a number of the younger musicians actually made their careers and reputations in some of these revolutionary groups. They also co-opted musicians to sing for the revolution, and I have just heartrending testimony from several musicians about what it was like and how they were for forced to go to these sessions, and they were forced to sing the revolutionary songs. There were a whole new genre of revolutionary songs. There was also stuff you couldn't really believe. When I was living there early in the revolution, there were a lot of Chinese in the first wave of foreign aid, and there were Chinese doctors, and I would actually turn on the radio and I would hear Chinese opera early on. So, I mean, it was wacky, and a lot of different things. In the back, there's somebody. Yeah.
How are you? My name is Alan Banks. It's a pleasure to meet everybody.
Thank
Well,
you.
we haven't all met, but it's a pleasure to be with you all. I just want to know, what are your thoughts on rap music and the cultural influence of rap music, and do the Sentinels listen to rap music? And
There are lots of Ethiopian rappers.
how are they influenced by Western
both
culture?
at home and in the U.S. And it's interesting, sitting right in front of you is a colleague who specializes in rap in Taiwan, and she could probably tell us more
Really?
about rap in Ethiopia, too. Meredith Swan.
Wow.
But this is the problem, Meredith. You probably
that's
know as much
awesome.
about it as I do. I have worked with a couple of rappers here. Burnt Face is one from California, and they're kind of collaborations that are going on with rappers and other musicians and other styles. And there is both Ethiopian rap in Amharic and other languages, and there's some starting in English. It's been a tradition slow to move to English, so it's not had much of any audience outside the community. And the fact that the, like comics, there are a lot of comedians who do a lot of heightened speech and things in their acts, and they tend to do it mainly in Ethiopian vernacular languages. And this even leaves out the kids, because a lot of the young people in the community have not learned Amharic and Tigrinya and the other languages, Oromo of the country. So yes, there is rap. There's a lot of rap, and there is rap among the American diaspora, and that would be a great master's project or dissertation topic for some independent soul. Can't do it all.
Thank
Yes, you're welcome. There's a question in front. Yeah.
Hello, I just wanted to echo everyone's thanks for
you're
your
welcome.
presentation. And I wanted to build off of Millary's question a bit, because when you mentioned Sentinels in the Marvel Universe, I used to watch X-Men all the time as a
Good.
kid, the cartoon and the comic books as well. They're actually bad characters, They're
Yep.
they're the ones who are hunting those who
Yep.
actually have a kind of moral authority. And so I wanted to ask you how you've thought through when musicians actually don't have a moral authority and seem to be working
Yes.
against what is considered good and best for society as a whole.
When musicians have immoral authority, I guess we might want to call it, or amoral authority. Yes, it really is an issue, and I sort of alluded to that at the end. I didn't get to the dark side. And I mean, there are a lot of eras that one, in different places that one might cite. Surely Nazi Germany comes to mind, and I think of the use of Wagner's music. I think of the use of Wagner's music during his life, coupled with his writings, which were so racist and so anti-Semitic. And then his music itself took on that sort of moral authority, and the performance of the music was seen by some as a statement of prejudice. I'm thinking in Ethiopia, the new revolutionary songs, it's rather like the Cultural Revolution in China, when you got a whole new repertory of music. There was this one song, Ha Ho Ethiopia Tikdem. It was Ha Ho Ethiopia first, sung everywhere during the revolution. And there were all these new national anthems. One anthem would be introduced, and then somebody would overthrow, and another anthem. So, and actually national anthems have a lot of authority. I mean, you think of how they're used at the Olympics, they're used internationally, they're used nationally, and they're much more than just a statement of patriotism in a national sense. So I think there are lots of examples, and I'm trying to think in Ethiopia, it would probably depend who you ask as to what example they would give you. I mean, there's a lot of interethnic tension and has been for many years. And there's one musician with whom I've worked closely who is a great symbol. I thought about talking about him and I couldn't talk about everybody. His name is Ali Bira, and he's of Oromo heritage and grew up in Diradawa and a more southern town. And this was it was a majority population that was treated very badly over the years by a succession of emperors. And much of the flowering of Oromo patriotism and I would say call for rights came from musicians, including Ali Bira. And today you can hear his music on international Oromo networks. And it's very interesting. I was giving a talk at one point in Minnesota, and there's a big Oromo community there. And I mentioned I was doing a national anthems, and a kid just raised his hand and said, "Oh, well, I don't do the Ethiopian national anthem, the Oromo national anthem by Ali Bira." So this is something very, very well known. But if you ask someone from another ethnic community that was in conflict and was worried about the rise of Oromo power, they would have found the song probably very threatening. And much of the music, which also had wax and gold in Afan Oromo language, as actually threatening them. So, I mean, it can also depend on one's own positionality, in other words. So does that answer your question? I think there are a lot of answers to that question, but yes, there are a lot of examples, and I haven't figured out what to do with this in the book yet. Maybe in the way I've just done in talking about positionality. Yeah.
I have a bunch of questions, and I just got another one. The one I just got was being reminded that I wasn't sure I understood the wax and gold metaphor. The two questions that I was going to ask, they're very disconnected. The first one is, does Ethiopian church music have a musicological connection to Arabic church music or to some other kind of, or to Greek Orthodox? I mean, what is anyway, that was the first question. The second question, which is completely different, was I read an article a couple years ago in the Times about jazz music clubs in Addis. And I just wondered, what's the relationship between these traditional musicians that might be seen as emerging authentically in a kind of folk context with contemporary Ethiopian popular music, which I suppose is a version of the rap question, but it was... Yeah. But I was just curious to think about whether there's a sense of tension, whether modern pop musicians are like, oh, I'm not, these old guys, we don't want that, or whether there's a way that two things are blending a little bit.
Okay. Quick answer. Wax and gold, it comes from the lost wax process of goldsmithing, and the wax is the outer meaning, and then the gold is the inner meaning, but actually in the process, the hot molten gold melts the wax.
What does that mean in music? That's what
it's a textual metaphor. It's the text itself. Although the modal systems and then the various categories do have meanings associated with them, especially one particular type of melody which expresses nostalgia and longing. So there's some interesting things, but not double layers in quite the same way. In terms of the Ethiopian church, its music is really indigenous and its own. I've done a huge study with a colleague who's a medievalist of the history of the Ethiopian church tradition. And we really worked from my contemporary field work back into manuscripts, going all the way back. And and the colleague, who is a real authority on other Eastern and Eastern Orthodox traditions, sees no connections. You do find a few sections in Greek text, but there are, and the use of liturgical portions, you have texts that have been translated, for example, from Greek into Giz, which is the sacred language, the liturgical language. But you don't find, and there are books and treatises that were translated through the Egyptian church in Arabic and in Coptic to Giz. which is the liturgical language of Ethiopia, but it really is its own tradition. And some people by mistake call it Coptic church because the Ethiopians for centuries had a Coptic patriarch from Alexandria, but that he was a figurehead. And it was not a position. It was the politics of Eastern Orthodoxy. In terms of the traditional musicians, you find a lot of interaction and of many, many different types, because there has been a lot of collaboration and drawing on traditional resources in Ethio jazz, for example, where Ethiopian modes are used with a standard jazz ensemble. You might look into the music of Mulatto Astatke, who's probably the most famous composer in Ethio jazz, and there are recordings of his also in the Ethio Peaks series, and also so much stuff is on YouTube. I mean, none of this is a mystery anymore because you can find it. In terms of other types of popular music, you also find all sorts of syntheses and hybridity, and you find people cutting across traditional and more modernist forms. You also have a number of groups now outside of Ethiopia working with Ethiopian music, in part the impact of the Ethio Peaks series, and they are using it and transforming it. And some of them invite traditional Ethiopian musicians to play with them. And so you actually will see this sort of collaboration on stage, and there have been some compositions and a lot of improvisations. There is a group in Somerville, Massachusetts called the Ether Orchestra that does a lot of things, a lot of recordings. They have a volume in the Ethio Peaks series. There's a group in the Netherlands. I mean, they're everywhere, these groups, and each of them sort of performs with a different set of traditional Ethiopian musicians, so it's quite interesting. You're welcome. Did I wear you out? Just about.
Have we worn you out? Do you have
No,
time?
not at all.
Okay. That was such a fascinating answer to Suzanne's question. But I sort of wanted to return to Kwame's question about the possibility of a bad sentinel.
Yes, clearly I've got to give this attention. Yes,
well,
thank you all.
Well,
okay.
I was thinking about that because my mind also went to Nazi Germany, and I was thinking not of Wagner but of Richard Strauss, who sort of did not distinguish himself by the way he sort of played along for a bit, although probably without intending to. He just sort of did it to save his own,
Yeah.
But it brought to mind thinking about how musicians can be used, even if they don't intend. So I guess I was wondering though, if as you stray from the idea of the individual singer-songwriter and you do move towards, opera composers, I wonder if the role of sentinel changes. Like, so, once a musician is picked up and the work circulates, I think you understand my question.
Well, how far can the concept be extended? And I was looking for a way to talk about individual agency and the agency of musicians, although one does have groups of musicians who seek to do good works, I suppose, or bad works. And then I guess you'd have to talk about the agency of the group. I don't know. Maybe you can answer this as well as me. I mean, it's something I'm thinking about. Are there people to whom one wouldn't apply this concept because of a repertory with which they were associated? I mean, does the fact, that someone like Bono really does have huge resources, and others, I'm thinking about Lady Gaga, who goes around and actually does some very good things, many other musicians we can think of. And maybe, does it not count if you have so much that it's not difficult? Does it have to be someone who really has to struggle to do this? Because I'm watching all these musicians who have nothing reaching out and doing things for others. And that's where this idea started. But then I realized there were other people who have done really very meritorious things. And maybe we needed to think about musicians in general. I mean, it's a very unsettling category, being a musician, both for the good and for the bad. And it's a very ambivalent category in most societies. And we're in a very bad time for the arts and humanities. And in any event, I suppose this is why I don't want to talk about it as a bad thing. But I do need to bring it up because obviously anything can be malleable and used in a number of different ways. Did I answer your question? I don't know.
Yes. Thank you very much.
There's someone next to you. Yeah.
if you have time for one more.
I have lots of time.
I've been sitting over here thinking about the role of, or the dialogue between the notes of the music and the lyrics of the music. And then I guess the way to frame my question is, what separates the sentinel musician from the sentinel poet, from the sentinel novelist, from the sentinel?
I've been thinking a lot about that. And I've been thinking about it. I have one case study in particular, an extraordinary man who I am tempted to call sentinel musician zero in this particular community, because he left during just like on the cusp of the revolution. He somehow got out. He had been involved with music. He's not a performer, but he owned record stores and he started the first record label. So what do I do with someone like that? I mean, at least Alam Sahai Wadajo writes song lyrics, but what do I do with someone who actually is an aficionado, you know, he loves music and it's his life, and the first thing he bought was his own record player. So how do you handle it? And then I've thought, yeah, well, does this really apply to artists more generally? And but that may be biting off more than I can chew. Would you argue that it does? I'm sorry, that's not fair, I know.
No, it's perfectly fair. I asked the question. I don't know. I'm trying to work out
Yeah.
the difference between. I think the idea of the sentinel artist
Yeah.
is absolutely compelling,
Mhm.
and I also think there must be something that separates the sentinel musician from other sentinel artists.
I think it's
But how to describe that?
Well, thank you. That's a really good point. I think that with the visual arts, I mean, there are artists who perform as they draw or paint, but generally that's a separate process. So I think performance is one of the variables here. And I do think that there is something with the cognition of musical sound that makes musicians more aware visually, aurally, to the scenes around them. And music tends to cross boundaries so easily. So I do think musicians on a sensory level are a somewhat different case. And actually, this has been so interesting because it's gotten me into sensory studies. And I knew that the church ceremonies, I played it for you and you saw a picture, but if you watch it, there's incense and there's dance and there are instruments and there's chant, and it's so multisensory. And what I have found out is that there actually is the notion of 7 senses in Ethiopia, not 5, and the extra senses are the legs and the feet, and I wonder if that's dance. And then the last one is sex organs, which I find fascinating, and that's hard to explain in terms of the church, but it sure is interesting. Yeah, but thank you. Why is the musician different? Yeah, thank you. Pleasure. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thanks.